Good morning and welcome to the Monday Morning Marketing Podcast. I'm Esther.
And I'm Melanie.
And today we're joined by Charlotte Foster, podcast producer from Charlotte Foster Podcasts, an agency that helps companies make branded podcasts. And we're talking about podcasting. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you for having me. It's a relief we're talking about podcasting, isn't it?
Well, we couldn't really talk about anything else after that intro. So, Charlotte, we met a few months ago and just totally hit it off. So we had to have you on the podcast. What got you into podcasting?
Everyone laughs at this story, including myself. So my background's worked in radio. I always say I've done pretty much every job working in radio, from making the tea for the presenters who like to call themselves the talent. I've said that with enough sarcasm. I hope that everyone understood how much I think about it. To actually be in the talent one day as well. So I used to be one of those annoying breakfast presenters who would sound really awake and alive at 7 o'clock in the morning. And the reason I sounded awake and alive at 7 o'clock in the morning is because I'd been up since 4 a.m. So it's not glamorous working in radio. So I kind of was freelancing in radio. So basically I was the substitute teacher. That's the way I always say it. When a radio station needed someone to go in and read the news, I would rock up and do it. And I kind of felt a little lost doing that because I wasn't working where I was living, whereas I had been working at the local radio station and I'd left there. And I sort of felt like a little bit of a disconnect, really, with what was going on around me. But I was reading the news in Liverpool, Manchester, Derby, but not in Staffordshire where I was living. So the city that I lived in, Stoke-on-Trent, was going for the City of Culture bid for 2021. It didn't get it, but I think after 2021, it was quite a relief that we didn't get it because, it had been ruined by the pandemic, let's be honest.
Yeah.
But at the time, the city was going for it, and it just felt positive because for those who don't know Stoke-on-Trent, it's a post-industrialised city that is a little bit down on its luck, I think is the best way to say it. Lots built on the pottery industry. The pottery industry has moved abroad. So there's lots of kind of negatives about the city, but actually there's loads of really good stuff about the city as well. The people are brilliant. There's lots of hope. There's lots of, let's push things forward. But nationally, people laugh about Stoke-on-Trent and joke about Stoke-on-Trent. It's a bit of like a butt of the jokes sort of thing. And there was, stick with me on this, there was a by-election in the city for an MP a new MP, because the sitting one had quit his job. And he got a better offer at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So he decided, actually, what shall I do? Go work at the V&A or be an MP in a city that doesn't really like me at the moment? Anyway, so UKIP was standing in the city and Stoke-on-Trent had a really strong Brexit vote and everybody thought UKIP was going to do quite well in the city. So it had a lot of national media attention. And the national media attention went something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but it went something along the lines of, oh, look, we've come up from London where everything's brilliant. And if you look at Stoke-on-Trent, everybody's poor. They all voted for Brexit, so they must be thick as well. And look, everything's boarded up. Oh, well, I'm going to go back to London where the streets are paved with gold. Like I say, paraphrase slightly, but that was it. And I got really angry that wasn't the Stoke-on-Trent I knew. And I'm not sitting here with rose-tinted glasses on going, everything's lovely in Stoke. It really, there's stuff that needs changing. But that isn't the city I know. So I was like, what can I do about this? I'm really angry that people are saying so many bad things. And I knew that if I was still working at the BBC radio station that I was working at previously in Stoke, that I'd be on the radio banging my hand on the table going, come on, what are we going to do about this? How can we show the world that Stoke-on-Trent isn't this place that they seem to think it is? And I just went, why don't I do a podcast about it? It just took me ages to kind of like, bing, do a podcast about it. I do my own radio kind of thing, even though podcast and radio are very different, which I learned quite quickly when I spent about 6 months preparing this podcast about Stoke-on-Trent, because I planned it in the same way you would plan a Radio 4 award-winning documentary. It was like minutely detailed to everything. And then I heard that the city had been shortlisted for the City of Culture Awards. And I went, I need to get this podcast out pretty quickly to go off the back of it. So I did a podcast about culture in Stoke-on-Trent. And that's where everyone laughs when they say, ha, culture in Stoke-on-Trent. Ha ha. But what I was doing was I was talking to people at a real kind of community level and hearing their stories. So people who run knit and natter groups, people who organise street parties on their streets for or estates, that sort of level, almost too local for local radio, too hyper local. But what it did was amazing. I was amazed at the response. I had listeners in pretty much every continent across the world listening to this 15-minute podcast talking to people in Stoke-on-Trent about what was going on in the city. And it all had to be kind of positive stuff. Every continent in the world, across the country, across the world. I think Antarctica was missing, which is a shame. But, and then the response from people was, oh, Charlotte, you do a podcast. I'd like to be on the podcast because I've got this to talk about. And we built up this huge momentum really quickly. And that's what I became known for. I wasn't known for waking people up every morning, Monday to Friday on the radio show. I was known for doing this podcast. And people would come to me and go, oh, I've got a press release about this event we're doing. Charlotte, would you like to come along? Charlotte, would you mind hosting this event for us? Because you're culture, aren't you? You do culture. Would you host this event for us? And then it became, I was on the City Council did like a cultural forum. They asked, would I like to be on the cultural forum for there? I'm a non-executive director of an arts organisation, which is the CIC, because of me starting this out, of this cultural podcast about Stoke-on-Trent. And if anyone knew me at school and I'd said to them, I'm involved in an arts organisation, I'm involved in culture, my art teacher would have absolutely just died with laughter because I can't draw a stick man. I cannot, But because I got myself involved in the world and I got known really, really well and quickly with the podcast, that's what I became known for and famous for. And then people started asking me about podcasting, so it's sort of like, oh, Charlotte, you do a podcast. Can you tell me more about podcasts? So I started doing some workshops with people saying, oh, this is what a podcast is. This is what it's good for. And then it dawned on me that actually this might be a business opportunity and that actually businesses could really do well for it. Because if you want to become famous for something very quickly, and when I say famous, I don't mean Brad Pitt famous. I mean famous in the world you're in. Then podcasting is a great way to do it. So that's how it all started. Just a little podcast about Stoke-on-Trent and the culture in the city.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us at the podcast.
You asked, I answered.
Quite seriously, what would be your takeaway for people who are listening to this podcast? It sounds like you're very, very niched when you started. So is it niching that's going to really help a business really stand out and get all these invites into certain areas?
100% it's being niche. So I'm sure we've all listened to podcasts. There's lots of podcasts out there. I have a talk and a little, what's the word I'm looking for? A little bugbear about dudes talking rubbish. And I've sanitized it for the podcast because the title of it is something different. Dudes talking rubbish. Yeah. That's the podcast that is over. There's too many of them. The market is saturated, and it's where people just go, oh yeah, so here's my thing, and this is what I'm going to talk about, and here's my thing, and yeah, I agree with you, yeah, and it just becomes boring. I'm just going to say it's boring and too general, and you start to see the same guests on the same podcasts at the same time. That the inspirational story podcasts. Now, I love an inspirational story as much as the next person. But I've heard the same story 1,000 times, I think, at least. And you know what? It doesn't affect. I'm not going to solve my problems by walking up Mount Everest for many reasons. Number one, I'm not going to walk up Mount Everest for love nor money. Number two, I don't have the money to walk up Mount Everest and take all that time off my day job. So I don't really want to hear from someone who solved their problems because they went, and had to walk up Mount Everest and now they're all happy again, right? That's not relevant. And there's lots of those stories out there. If you can niche it down and talk about one thing really, really well, then that's how you're going to get hurt. It's about that, is it inch wide, mile deep? I can't remember who said that, but someone very clever said that. So know your subject, talk about your one subject very, very well, and it's be famous for that. Yeah.
So for people starting out in podcasting, because like we said just before we came on this, Melanie and I have only been doing this, I want to say 2 years now.
That's really experienced, by the way.
Oh,
2 years is
okay.
a long time for people to be podcasting.
Yay, we
It's
experienced.
a good achievement.
It doesn't mean we're any good, mate. It just means we've been doing it a while.
Oh, well, okay.
It is an achievement, though.
It is, right? We were nominated last year for Podcast of the Year, but,
Just saying.
that's just saying. But when people just start out, can they just use their phone and,
Yeah, absolutely.
do they need fancy equipment? What software, what hardware, what, people need
It
to...
is mind-blowing, right? You go on, if you type onto Google and go, I want to start a podcast, you'll have so much out there. I started mine using my phone. So I have an Apple iPhone. I used a voice memo app that's already on the phone. There's another one you can use. There's lots of them on there that you can use, but I just use my voice memo app. And this was part of my problem because I spent so long over planning it. And then I just went, I haven't got a microphone. I haven't got this. I can't do it. When I worked at the BBC, which wasn't that long ago, we were being sent out to do interviews for the radio using our mobile phones. So if it's good enough for the BBC, it's good enough for your podcast, okay? The other thing you can do, and even if you're just
that really
on your...
surprises me.
No, honestly, you're just doing this, just doing that. Just, microphone is your phone is your microphone. The biggest tip I can give, though, if you're on your own recording a podcast, right, on The Apprentice, they walk around with the phones on speakerphone and they're talking into it, like they're holding the phone up to their mouth. They haven't got it up their ear in the traditional phone style. They're holding it up to their mouth. My biggest tip is don't record like that because it sounds really breathy. If you're just on your own recording like a monologue podcast, or just hold your phone up to your ear as though you're talking on the phone to somebody, because that's how your microphone on your phone is designed to work. It'll cut out background noise. It'll do all the fancy stuff. That's the premium way of getting it recorded like that. But that's all you need, a phone. And then if you want to do the editing yourself, if it's just a simple edit, top and tail, you want to keep all your mistakes or your ums and ers in there, and don't over edit is my biggest tip as well. If you've got a Mac, you can use GarageBand. It's there already. If you haven't, download Audacity. It's free. And it's really simple to use. Loads of tutorials on YouTube that you can find. And then you can upload it via Anchor, which is a free podcast host. And they do all the hard work for you of getting all the technical stuff and making sure it goes to Apple Podcasts, it goes to Spotify, it goes to Google Podcasts, and it goes wherever else. It really is really, really simple. I promise.
So you don't need the thousands and thousands of pounds, dollars, euros, insert your currency here, to start and get...
No,
going.
But don't tell my husband that because I've told him I need all these microphones.
I taught mine the same.
9 microphones and counting we're at.
9? Oh my God.
And I've got another few on the wish list as well.
So what about planning? Okay, because, that, is not admittedly our strongest point, but it is something that we do. But it is something that we do know makes a significant difference to the success of a podcast. How far in advance would you plan your podcasting schedule? Is it vital to have guests on, or is it okay to do it, either on your own or with a partner in your business? I mean, is there a magic formula that makes this work?
What I love most about podcasts is the answer to every question is, well, it depends. There we go. So it really depends on what you want to do. My biggest tip, again, if you're just starting, just commit to a series. And that makes your planning a lot easier. So just commit to a series of podcasts that you're going to do. So say 6 to 10 episodes, whatever feels right for you. And then you can plan them out so that they make sense. They flow almost like a book, so that episode 1 is chapter 1 and it moves along nicely. You have one theme for that series. so that you can talk about all of what your thing in that one theme. So for me, if I was doing a podcast about podcasting, which I used to do, the series 1 would be how to start a podcast, as basic as that, and then you'd go through all the different things you need to do. Series 2 could be how to grow your podcast. Series 3, and this is just off the top of my head, could be how to maintain your podcast in different times. So have a theme, have a set amount of episodes that you're going to do, and record and plan what each of those is going to say so that they're bingeable. You want people listening to your content for as much as possible, don't you? Think of it as Netflix. And when you're going, you see Netflix and you're like, right, excellent, I know I've got 6 episodes and I'm going to sit down and watch them all on Netflix. For you, again, podcast, I've got 6 episodes. When am I going to listen to them? Then. It's about keeping people listening, because the more they're listening to you, the more their voice is in your ear, or your voice is in their ears. And you're building up that relationship. If you want to have somebody on your podcast, have somebody on your podcast, but the planning becomes a little bit more tricky. Who says what? How do they say it? When you're doing it? Guests. I love having guests. I love being a guest, but guests can be a pain in the backside, right? And I'm not going to tell everyone that you're nodding your head viciously here, the pair of you. But the problem with guests is you go, brilliant, that's all booked in the diary. We're going to put that episode out 2 days after the recording. The guest cancels the day before you're meant to record. You have a big gap in your schedule. If you're going to go for guests, make sure they're either so far in advance, if you're doing like a continuing one, you've booked them in, well in advance, so that if they do cancel, you can rearrange and not have a midnight panic. Or make sure you're recording everything before you put it out, so that you've got it all there. And if you want to, I quite like doing a series and just putting it all out in one go, in the same way that Netflix will drop a series, because it's there and you can just refer to it all the time. And once it's there, it's done, and you can just chill out, and it's good to have. And it's quite fun to do it that way. Let people binge when they want it, rather than keeping coming back. But you can still class it as like a weekly thing if you wanted to, by putting your stuff out each week and going, don't forget, in this episode I talk about this, and have your content across with it that way. So yeah, it depends.
When you went on holiday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, when you've got your podcast, we found out quite late how significant show notes were in helping you get found in search. We've got them now, but who would you use to get them transcribed? Is there a tool, or would you use a VA? Or how important are show notes in helping your discovery?
So show notes and transcriptions are different. So transcription is the episode word for word, but I have a transcriber that I use. And I know, dead posh, right? She says, right, in it. So I get someone who does the transcribing, and they're so good because they will write it in an easy to read way. So all the ers that I do, get rid of, and all of that. I have that because I use Captivate for my podcast hosting, and they have a little bit where you can add the transcription. So it's like a separate bit to the show notes. And that helps with the SEO, with the searching, with the Google scraping, all of the bits and defining it. It also massively, massively, massively helps people who have hearing difficulties. And that's so, so important, because accessibility is a really big thing for me, and making your podcast as accessible as possible. Another thing I didn't realize is I have a friend who teaches English as a foreign language, or a second language. Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Whatever. Anyway, teaches English abroad. And they use English language podcasts to help their students learn English, especially colloquial English as well. So if they have the transcription as well as the written, it can really, really help. So it's not, there's loads of different ways that transcribing helps. Transcribing also then helps me write my show notes, because I can take out all the bits that I thought were interesting. With show notes, you just have to really think about what people are searching for, or what you want people to search for when it comes to your podcast, and really make sure they are bang on. If you host your podcast on Google Podcasts, which I recommend you do, I recommend you host it wherever you can. If you go to the Google Podcast Manager, it will show you all the terms that people have typed in and found your podcast with. So the analytics on Google are great because you can go, oh, okay, so that question is bringing up that. So that can help you refine your show notes as well. And the other reason I like transcribing is it then is the basis for some social media posts and blog posts as well. Get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah.
That was a damn fine question, wasn't it?
Yeah, and like share your stuff out everywhere, right? I mean,
oh my God, right. There's lots of jokes out there, right? So I'm someone who does a lot of running, and the joke is always, how do you know someone's running a marathon? Don't worry, they'll tell you first. All right. It's true, isn't it? And I'll say this and upset some people as well. How do you know someone's a vegan? Don't worry, they'll tell you first. Right. So insert, how do you know someone does CrossFit? Don't worry, they'll tell you first. I'm offending everybody here in equal measures. But I say, but that's how you should be with a podcast. If you've got a podcast, the joke should be, how do you know someone's got a podcast? Don't worry, they'll tell you first. I have a t-shirt that says, I have a podcast on it. And I have one that says, ask me about my podcast. That's how you need to be. And there's ways and means you can do it as well. So if you're using podcasting for your business, which I really recommend you do, you know those people that ask questions all the time and you know they're not going to pay you any money. They just want your expertise for free. Oh, can we have a coffee and a catch up? No, we can't. How about you listen to this episode of my podcast where I talk about exactly what you want to talk about? It's a really good way of getting rid of the tire kickers. Or actually, those tire kickers then become, they know what they're talking about. I will come in and start investing in you. It's it's one of my favorite things, especially, you get loads of messages. I don't know, I get loads of messages on LinkedIn. Charlotte, I was just wondering if you could help me with this. Here's my podcast episode where I explained it all.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
And so we talked about getting started for free, but when should you start investing in your 9 microphones and your paid audio platforms and things like that?
When you know it works for you. It might not work for you. Podcasting isn't necessarily going to work for everybody. If it's something that you can see working for you, you've done it, you've enjoyed it. There you go. There's your first thing. You might hate it. I hate video. I absolutely hate video. So I've gone no further than a selfie stick thing. Tripod, that's the word. And I'm not going to do any more. You're not going to see me on TikTok. You're not going to see me on Instagram Reels. You're not going to see me do a LinkedIn Live, even though I have I've had the ability to do it for quite some time. I'm like, nah, don't need to do that. Don't want to do that. It's not my thing. So I'm not going to invest in camera equipment. If you've started podcasting and you love it and you're seeing some return from it as well. And when I say return, you're not going to be Joe Rogan anytime soon, I'm afraid. But what you might do is get clients. You will get people onto your list, your email list, into your Facebook group, whatever it is. That's when I would start saying, then you start investing. Then you start going, okay, the iPhone isn't necessarily the one I want, the microphone of choice anymore. And then you start looking, and you can get a decent USB microphone for around the £100 mark. Which isn't expensive, really. And it's so good. You just plug it in and you talk. What more? It's just brilliant.
Yeah. Keep it simple.
And it sounds like we can hit you up for some spare mics as well.
No, they're not spare. They're not spare. Just be very clear here. They are not spare.
They're for the surround sound effect. So they capture all angles.
They capture all angles. And also, I do go to places and so part of the services I offer is I go to businesses and we have a little recording session on the day. So I take my kit to them and I watch them like a hawk. I'm like, don't look, no drinks in here. Do you know how much this costs? So that's one of the things I do is I go into businesses and do the recording for them as like a producer of headphones and everything.
And how can people get in touch with you then if they would like to hire you for your services?
They can find me at, I'm on LinkedIn, Charlotte Foster. And I kind of put myself down as the podcast queen because I come from Royal Berkshire, for goodness sake. I must get some royalness somewhere. And also my website is charlotte-foster.co.uk. And those two places, I said, I'm not active on my website. I'm active on LinkedIn, is the sort of like the social platform if that can be a social platform, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. We've really enjoyed your stories, basically, of explaining the explosion of your business and the fact that it started from ultimately a problem you were having. Solutions come out of problems we're having, and we know we're not the only ones having them.
Yeah, I never imagined I would be running a business. Never. I used it to try and get a job back in radio, and now I've got a business.
Now you're stuck with it.
I'm like, oh, this is not what I meant to happen. One quick tip. I know you want to finish up. One quick tip. Before you start your podcast, decide what your success measure is. Decide what success looks like for you. And keep going back to it and understanding it. And success is whatever you want it to be. It doesn't have to be number one in the Apple podcast charts. It can be getting 10 people on your list, getting one new client, but decide for yourself what success is. Sorry.
That's an excellent tip. You're quite right. People don't ask enough calls to action in their podcasts. They just speak and hope that does enough, but you actually do have to add in a call to action.
Yeah, absolutely.
On that point, you can sign up for our podcast newsletter on the website.
Smooth.
Wasn't it? It'll be more planned for next time. Us planning? Never. But thanks again, Charlotte, for joining us today. That's it for us for another week. We'll be back next week with more Monday Morning Marketing Podcast. Until then, bye-bye.